All right, so we've just clicked over to 6 o'clock. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Wednesday night study. Glad you are here. And we'll continue tonight with a discussion based on a book that we started last week, The Ten Commandments from the Backside by J. Ellsworth Kalas. That's sort of the foundation for our discussions tonight. Miss all of you, as always. As we've been through this last couple of months, kind of apart but together this way. That's going to continue at least through June 1st. We are still suspended on in-person gathering at least through June 1st, and likely beyond that, and I'll explain that to you as I go on here. We received some other direction from the bishop's office this week, and you may have seen that email that went out yesterday. We have some further instructions from them to say that after June 1st, we are able to enter phase 1 of reopening. Some of the phase 1 criteria actually call for a flatter declining, actually I think it calls for a declining number of cases locally for 2 straight weeks, which is something that we haven't had in Tallapoosa County yet. We're still positive cases every day. They're going up by a little bit, but we're tracking that. I'm going to have conversations with the Duncan Administrative Board and individually with some of the leaders from Sunny Level in the next few days and in coming days. Monday night, I think, is when our Administrative Board meeting is. And we're going to have discussions. We're going to see how we need to proceed because if you got the email from last Friday, I reminded you or gave you our 3 criteria that we have outlined as our major points of being able to return to in-person worship. One would be advisement from the bishop's office, which we got this week, permission to enter phase 1. Number 2 in that list of criteria is a thorough look at the numbers, especially locally, and the advice of health officials. So we're kind of in that phase or in that step of criteria right now. And number 3 is also going on. We will need to have necessary supplies and organization to be able to take the precautions that we need, to have things like a thoroughly sanitized worship space, to have things like masks available if someone does not have one to wear during worship, and to be able to organize in such a way that we can do this with proper spacing when that happens. So connected to that, if you have not answered the questions in the email from last Friday, please do so as soon as you can. There are some questions there about how we can organize to keep our spacing when we do return to in-person worship, because we're going to have to keep 6 feet, and the way that we have laid out the sanctuaries, gone through and measured, and there are approximately 11 seating areas in the sanctuary. That could be 1 to 3, maybe 4 people. It's about a third of a pew. Okay, so however many in your family group maybe that could sit in about a third of a pew. But basically we're having to sort of reserve one of those spaces to be able to make sure that everybody's got a spot to be in for worship when we do return. Now at Duncan, there's one other thing that we can do. The front 2 rooms, the parlor and the nursery, we can move the furniture out of those, the existing furniture out of those, and be able to seat 10, maybe 12 more people in each of those rooms, again keeping proper distancing. So it's very important as we're doing this preparation in this phase 1 of preparation to be able to return to in-person worship. It's very important to get feedback on those questions like, would you be here when we open back up? How many would be with you in your family group? And would you be willing to sit in one of those front rooms if you're at Duncan and watch on the TV there rather than in the sanctuary itself? So those are important. We need to answer those questions and be able to organize that in such a way that we can go back to worship as soon as possible, but as safely as possible. We want to exercise all precaution that we possibly can. I realize we don't live in a zero-risk world. But we're going to get that number as close to 0 as we possibly can in this building before we come back in here together. I think we owe it to our Christian ethic to do that. In our Wesleyan tradition, I've said this before, I'll say it again. In our Wesleyan tradition, our general rules start with rule number 1, first, do no harm. And we're going to take that very seriously, to not do harm to the most vulnerable, especially. And ironically, some of the most vulnerable are often some of the first ones that'll come back in the building if there's a suspension of some type. So we want to try to make this as safe as possible. On that subject, there are some who have responded already to those questions. Some who have given, yes, we'll be back. Here's the number of people, and we'll be glad to sit, wherever. Others have responded that they won't come back in the building until the numbers have dropped substantially and or there is a vaccine. And I want you to know, if you're one of those people, if that is your position, that is fine. Do not feel pressured to come back in this building just because the doors are open. Don't feel in any way that you are pressured to come back in here. We will still offer online worship. We'll still have the videos there, at least of the sermons, every Sunday, and then Wednesday night with these videos as well. We do that on Facebook Live, and then try to get the videos over to YouTube as soon afterward as possible. As a side note on that, I'm having a little bit of a hard time getting YouTube to upload this past Sunday's video. So it's still available on Facebook and will be. For some reason, there's a problem with the video getting to YouTube. I've tried repeatedly. I'll continue to try, but there are some problems with that. But just be aware of that. So we got the Sunday morning, the Wednesday night, and then I've got a couple of emails that usually go out twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, most of the time. With maybe some devotional thoughts, some announcements, things that you need to know about. In the case of last Friday's email, those questions that we really need an answer from you on. So pay attention, check your mail on Tuesday night, Friday night, and make sure that you're getting those and you can stay in the loop with what's going on. So we'll continue our study of the book and starting conversation from that book in just a couple of minutes. First, let's take a word of prayer for those who are in need right now, and then we'll move along, okay? Gracious God, as we pause in these moments to study, to reflect, to look at where you would have us go, God, help us to do so with an open heart. Help us to open our ears to listen for your Spirit moving among us, and help us to know that we are the church. Wherever we happen to meet, we are the church, and help us to continue to do so, to be so as we have in so many creative ways. Help us to reach out to those who are hurting, to those who are struggling, to those who may need just a voice or a hand in some way. Help us to do that as we've been doing. Give us the strength to continue. Prop up those who are in particular need right now, whether that's illness or injury or hardship that's going on right now. God, give them strength and give them your peace. Soothe anxieties. Help with our stress. Help us to rest easy in you, looking forward in the strength and the confidence that you give us to live day to day. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So, as I said, we're working on a conversation starting with the book, The 10 Commandments from the Backsides by J. Ellsworth Kalas. And this is 10 Commandments maybe seen a little bit differently. Last week we looked at the first one, don't have any gods before me, rephrased to, let me make sure I get that correct. The rephrasing from last week on that first commandment. God will have all of you, is the way that is put. God will have all of you. So you can see it's rephrased just a little bit. Kind of taken a thou shalt not and turning it into a positive, into a you will do this rather than you won't do something. For instance, tonight, Exodus 20, verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven, above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath. All right, so don't make graven images, sometimes it's called. So Callus rephrases this one as, you shall adore the mystery which is beyond comprehension. All right, so how do we unpack that? From don't worship graven images to you shall adore the mystery which is beyond comprehension. All right, let's think about that a little bit. I mean, not many people today worry about this second commandment. Most of us probably don't think it applies to us very much because I think most of us could say, well, you know, I've never carved out anything and set it on a shelf and called it God. And in those feelings of, well, this doesn't really apply to me, we might do well to kind of, like I said, unpack this a little bit and see what it might actually come to apply for us. There's a warning that comes after that commandment in Exodus 20, verse 4. Talks about punishing children who of the people who do this, and blessing those who don't do this and who keep the commandments. Generation after generation, even, it talks about that. So that sort of language might seem a little out of pace with modern sort of life, but that commandment is still there, whether we like it or not. And I think we can find reason maybe to like it, because it can help us stretch a little bit. It's another expression of God's sort of yes for us as human beings. And it's meant, like we talked about last week, you know, rather than the commandments being meant to hem us in or prevent us from having fun or preventing us from having a good life, they're really meant to expand. Yeah, they're bumpers, you know, kind of, you could call them bumper rails, but at the same time, it's meant to expand the borders of life in a lot of substantial ways. One thing is pretty sure, though. This commandment was very, very serious for pious Jews. Still is. And the prophets that talk about it through the Old Testament, they were always very serious about that. You know, in the prophets, whenever the Israelite people wandered away from God, usually one of the first things mentioned by the prophets is that there's some sort of graven image going on. There's some sort of false idol going on. Israel even managed to break this commandment before the actual commandment on the tablet came down from the mountain, the scripture says. You know, when Moses is on Mount Sinai, actually receiving the commandments from God, story goes that Aaron and the people got together and they made this golden calf. They got bored, they got distracted, whatever. And before Moses could even come back down with the commandments, they're soon bowing down to this golden calf. By the time they got into the land, into the promised land, even after they got there, it didn't stop. Not too far along, Judges chapter 2, they're already bowing down to Baal and other gods there. The prophets found idol worship in a lot of different ways, really. They found it, okay, terrible, obviously, but they also found it kind of silly. You know, we talk about the prophets a lot, and I think we should, in respect to their language about being aware of the people around us, their social consciousness, we might call it, you know, to be aware of the widow and the orphan and the foreigner, and we should. You've heard me preach about that a lot. We admire them for the way that they gave us sort of visions of the Messiah to come. But they were also very big on this subject of idol worship and being against it, you know, and trying to help the people be against that. Jeremiah, for instance, one of the prophets, Jeremiah, he was you'd call him a rational guy, I think, but he was offended that the people, his people, were so irrational that they saw power somehow in graven idols. In one of the passages in Jeremiah 10, he talks about the idols have to be carried because they can't even walk. And so you could tell in that little line, he's thinking, well, how silly is that? You have to pick it up and carry it, can't even walk for itself? Really? Isaiah kind of felt the same sort of astonishment and silliness because he talked about cutting down a tree. All right, Isaiah talks about cutting down a cedar or a cypress, an oak, or whatever. He lists several trees. And then he talks about how the person who cuts down the tree would use half of it to carve their idol, and then they use the other half of the same tree to make a fire to cook their food or to heat their house. And he talks about how silly that is. You've got this tree, and the same tree, half of it is your idol and half of it is your heating and cooking source, right? So they see it both with a contempt and with sort of a view of, wow, this is really silly. But I don't think we need to completely dismiss it as silly, even as those 2 points are really. But I think we need to consider how we are kind of susceptible to some of the same sorts of mindsets. Okay, maybe not cutting down a tree and carving an idol, but the same sort of mindset. Superstitions come to mind. How many hotels have you ever been in that don't have a 13th floor? Or if, I don't know, somebody gets assigned row number 13 on the plane, do they ask to move, or do they change that reservation? Or, baseball players, and I don't want to pick on baseball players because I've known a lot of cool baseball players, but if you read about, particular in baseball, and it happens in a lot of other sports too, but baseball, it seems particular like this, that they'll have certain rituals that they go through. Before they go up to bat, they have to tap the bat on the ground so many times, they have to spin it, they have to hold it in certain ways, they have to have a certain tape on, they have to be wearing the right glove, they have to, all these things that have to be done in certain order so that they will improve their batting average, I guess. But and if it helps them psychologically, okay. But think about that. The kind of superstitions that we bring into life, and if superstition is kind of the sin of idol worship, we could have our problems with that just as much as ancient people did, right? But there is a greater sin than the superstition of it all. But the roots of that superstition, if idols are nothing but silliness, they wouldn't have been an issue for the prophets. But the prophets were right that any idol that is so silly to just be beyond comprehension, it would not only be silliness in itself, it would be a danger to the person who does the worshiping of that idol. You see what I'm saying? It'd be dangerous to the person who takes on that silliness or that superstition. The danger is in the perception of God. How do we see God? Right? I don't know if there's anything more important to spiritual development than how we see God. How do we regard God? Because how we see God is going to determine how we see a lot of other things, if not everything in our life. It's going to determine all the other pictures that we make in our lives as far as our judgment, our perception goes. It's going to be based on that picture that we have of God. You ever heard the story of the little, I heard the story long ago, this little boy, he's drawing with his crayons, and his mother asks him what he's drawing, and he says, I'm drawing God. And she says, well, nobody knows what God looks like. And the little boy looks up and says, well, they will after I'm finished with my drawing. Right? So there's some wisdom in that to say that this is kind of the essence of what we do. The essence of our idol making would be that when we're finished with whatever we're setting up as an idol, We'll know what God looks like. We'll know what our God looks like, right? There was a guy who grew up in Soviet Union, back when there was a Soviet Union, and as you know, it was mandated there, atheistic. There wasn't really any such thing as the church there. But this particular guy, he came to believe in Jesus through the course of his life. But he said, even in a society where I grew up and where I lived, everybody will always look for something to make into God. They will always look for something to believe in, some sort of idol to believe in. And he said it's going to be something grounded, and it's going to be earthly, and it's going to be limited. And I think he's onto something with that. That's the issue Jesus has when he's discussing with the woman at the well, Samaritan woman at the well. Her question is sort of bound to earth kind of question. She asked Jesus, okay, where is the right place for us to worship? And this may be something that we might want to take into account just incidentally these days. When we're thinking about, is worshiping in my living room just as good as getting in the building, or whatever. But this woman, she asked, where is the proper place to worship? Is it on this mountain that the Samaritans have endorsed these many years, or is it in Jerusalem at the temple where the Jews go? And Jesus says, well, it's neither, or both. It didn't really matter, he said, because God is spirit, and we who worship God will worship in spirit and in truth. Now that's true behind the stone or the wood or whatever. There is somebody's image of God. But physical images, I think the danger that's spoken by this commandment is physical images are limiting. If we limit God to one place, or looking one way, or being one thing, that shuts us in. And so you can see this commandment kind of expands our world, like we talked about at the beginning, right? There's more to God than our image of God. I mean, infinitely more. And to make an image of God is to restrict God to the place that what we'd be worshiping is a lie. You might say, well, God is a God of fruitfulness and plenty and bounty. Of course, absolutely, God is. But in the ancient world, that might have meant the god Baal, right? The god Baal was the god of fruitfulness and bounty. And so Baal became kind of an idol worship, this image worshipped for fruitfulness and bounty and good crops. But that image wouldn't let us go any further. If we want to worship Baal, we would stop right there. But God is beyond that. God is a God of fruitfulness and bounty, but God is much more than that. They restricted God. In any time we set up an idol, it restricts God to what can be seen or what we perceive with our own senses. That's important for us to learn from others. We can learn images, we can learn characteristics of God, but we have to be careful about making hard, fast, well, this is what God is pictures and making it stay the same. This is where we get the impression these days of, tell me if you've ever thought about this, right? That God as an old guy sitting on a cloud with long white hair and a beard. Right? We've heard that a gazillion times. We've all thought about that, okay, that's one picture. And pictures can be helpful, but they can also be limiting. For instance, if we stuck with that idea that we often have, usually as children, of God being an old guy with long white hair and a beard sitting on a cloud, that is going to limit our vision of who God is and what God does. And so we have to grow beyond that. An idol, a picture that we get fixated on and stay with and don't grow past, well, that insists that God is no more than this. God is just this thing that I've been picturing for so long. All right, so another question is, if idols are as helpless and as silly as the prophets declared, well, why did those idols continue to appeal to people? You know, sometimes we read the Old Testament, and I've thought about that a lot. You know, why did these people just continue to go back to Baal or whatever? For a nation that was as spiritually informed and spiritually grounded as the Israelite people, why would they be tempted by these other idols? I think the answer is probably pretty simple. Idols are manageable. The idea of an idol is they do what we want them to do, or we see them as doing what we want them to do, right? So we like things that can be managed. We want things that will do what we want them to do. It wasn't just ancient people, it's people now too. We like that. In our materialistic culture, you know, we want utility. We want things that do what we want them to do. Right? There's an example in the book. Callis talks about having known a lot of athletes, and it seems like I'm picking on athletes tonight, but not really. It's just an example he included in the book. But he talks about knowing athletes, and he says, you know, he's seen a lot of them over the years witness to their faith, and what a wonderful thing that is. But sometimes he says the interest he's seen has been a lot like those ancient people who prayed because they wanted their crops to grow. He said a lot of times he's seen witnesses that seem more like, I carry this faith because it helps me succeed. And sports people are not the only ones who would do that. Business people, trying to get a deal, teenager qualifying for college, a person trying to get a job, trying to get the right price on a house. You know, there are lots of things that we might start to think of God in terms of God is there to give me this thing that I want. And none of those things are bad in themselves. Wanting to get a good deal, wanting to succeed, wanting to do well in sports, wanting to get into a good college, all those things are fine in themselves. All right? But if we're saying that God is only there to provide those things for us, then we've limited God. All right? We've taken the God of the universe and reduced God to a vending machine for our purposes. Something that we can make claims on, something that we can manipulate, something that we can control. And that's where it becomes a problem. All right? And it's easy to have that kind of God and set things up in such a way that we think in that way. So, is that to say that we shouldn't ask God for material things? Absolutely not. We should. Jesus modeled that by saying, you know, pray, give us this day our daily bread. But as we've brought up many, many times, we get to the give us our daily bread after he's already established, hallowed be thy name. So it has to be in order. We want to see God as the God of the universe before we start asking for things. We want to see God as something beyond a mechanism to get us things before we ask for material things. And I don't think we can, if we put ourselves in the right mindset at the beginning of that prayer, hallowed be thy name, it's harder for us to get too greedy with it. it's harder to get greedy with it because we've put ourselves in a humble position to begin with. So back up just a little bit to that point that I talked about earlier. It harms the person who worships in such a small way too. It makes us smaller if we only see our God in such a small way. Hosea, the prophet Hosea, said that when the Israelites came to worship pagan idols, he said they consecrated themselves to a thing of shame and became detestable like the thing they loved. Wow. That's a kick in the knees, right? They came to worship this thing and they became detestable just like that thing that they were loving. If we bow down again and again to an image of an ox, then we kind of reduce ourselves a bit, don't we? We take on the image of an ox, not physically. But if an ox becomes my God and I humble myself before an ox, then the ox becomes something that possesses me, doesn't it? Somehow that ox has become greater than the person worshiping in front of it. If we measured our lives, for instance, by our abundance, in the old days, crops, these days, money or property or house or car or whatever, we're limiting ourselves. We're making ourselves smaller. We've become inferior to whatever it is. If it's money or property or success or whatever, then we have become inferior to that. So to think that God created us in God's image, and then we would reduce ourselves to make ourselves less valuable than something like a piece of property or a vault of money or a car or whatever, you can see how silly that becomes. So what kind of God would this law, would this commandment want us to bow down to? I think it calls for us to bow down to the God of the universe, this God that is beyond us. That is God. It's not a picture, it's not a carving, it's not something earthbound or physical, it's God beyond us. Anselm, who was an 11th century Archbishop of Canterbury, he said that God is that the greater than which we cannot conceive. Think about that. Defining God, he said, God is that the greater than which we cannot conceive. We can't even think of anything that would be greater than God. Anselm says that's who God is. If you can't think of anything that could be greater than God, that's who God is. We couldn't make anything that would rival that God. We couldn't carve anything or draw anything or describe anything that would be greater than that God, could we? And of course, we will have our mental images of God. We have to kind of process the relationship with God. When we're talking about relational connection to God, we have to have some sort of mental image. And the Bible lays out all sorts of possibilities. Father, Spirit, Savior, Creator, Sustainer, all these different things to which our brains can give pictures to help us connect. But all of them describe, all the descriptions of God, always talk about this God beyond us, that is a God in action for us. And so, every day, each moment of prayer, each action of trying to live following Jesus, every experience of grace, every time we feel the presence of God, all that gets added in to whatever picture we may have had. We may have started when we were kids with the picture of the old guy with the long white hair and beard sitting on a cloud. Since then, hopefully, we've added to that picture. That picture has changed and grown and developed because we have come to know that God is beyond us and beyond our ability to peg into one picture. And God will always be beyond us, and we should be thankful for that. Athanasius, another church father back in the 4th century, Athanasius says, when he wrote about faith in God, as though he were trying to catch hold of the whirlwind, is the way he described trying to get a handle on who God is exactly. So if we could grab onto the wind, we could grab onto God, right? And that is, I think that's another good description. So let's put that in. We start with our old man with the long white hair and beard sitting on a cloud. Then we add, but he's greater than anything I can think about. And then we add that it's like trying to catch the wind. And all of these things start to inform how do we see God. Paul tried to describe Christ in ways that tell us Christ, though physical representation, a physical picture of God when he was here, is beyond that. He came from beyond that to give us a picture to start with. And if we can't find the words even, if the Apostle Paul couldn't find the words, if we can't find the words to adequately describe God, then I think we're in a good place. Beyond our ability to describe. We can try, and we do. We want to. But that's a good thing to say that, God is beyond describing. And God is beyond images of wood or stone or glass or canvas or whatever. And when we get to that place, we start to see how this law makes more and more sense, right? The law forbids these graven images. And we see how much more sense the prophets made when they looked upon the horror and the silliness of honoring something like that, of bowing down to something like that. Since God is greater than anything else we could conceive, how does it distort that image to try to cram God into something that we can describe or draw or carve or build? Even though we may want to carve and draw and build and do things of beauty in acts of love and admiration and awe of God, we need to realize that it doesn't stop with that. God does not stop with that. God cannot be contained by that. Someone said that to fill God's place with an image would be like if you blotted out the sun and then turned on a 15-watt bulb. Whatever we do is just inadequate to describe. Now we make our best shot, but it is inadequate to describe, and we need to remember that God is beyond that. There is so much of God to be known, too much to be known in this world, beyond our brains. And the really terrible thing, base about idols, they give us nothing to reach for in our creation. We were created for connection to the Almighty, not connection to something that can be constructed on this earth. And believing is more than seeing. We talk about faith a lot, and faith, belief, trust. It's more than being able to see. It's more than even being able to learn in our brains or experience with our senses. And bottom line, I think the second commandment, it sets us free to enter into a space of infinite grandeur of God, the infinity that God is, and maybe start to not only be limited to one image, whatever that image we have of God is, but to realize that we can spend our whole lives with Him, adding and learning and seeing and experiencing and building and growing in the way that we see God. We'll never get there on this side of life, but the joy is in experiencing the God that is beyond us. So there's our second commandment. And I'd like to offer a quick word of prayer before we close up tonight. God, may your Spirit build in us an image of you that cannot be contained by our imagination. Help us to see you beyond ourselves and yet intimately connected to us. You are personal, you are with us, and you invite us into a journey to know you more as we go forward from here. Help us to do that. In Christ's name, amen. All right, so I'll see you Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. Look for another email Friday, probably Friday afternoon. And if I have any other news, I'll pass that out to you. And hope you have a great week. Stay safe, stay healthy. God bless. And I'll see you Sunday.